Good morning. I'm Barry Bergdoll, Chief Curator of Architecture and Design here at the Museum of Modern Art, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you all and to what I think is going to be an extraordinary day, and especially to be the host to a organization that I think is doing such incredible, vital work. I'd like to think, and I think Charles in a moment is going to echo some of this, that our work since what I call the landscape turn at MoMA with the Groundswell exhibition, and many of you were in it on the wall. I think most of you were probably in it in the galleries. And I think since then, our work here at MoMA has been trying to parallel some of the incredible enrichment of interdisciplinary thinking that is also at the core of the work of the Cultural Landscape Foundation. So it's very exciting for us to have you here. We don't have anything in the galleries at the moment to reflect that, but I would, if you have a moment during lunch, invite you up to our galleries on the third floor, if only to see, before it is taken down on Monday, the incredible counter-proposal to Ground Zero by the United Architects team, now a 10-year-old project, and I think a little bit too distant in our memory. And it is in front of the curtain wall on the third floor and has an incredible dialogue with some of the postmodern buildings along Fifth Avenue. And it's a moment that's, I just wanted to signal to you, take you 3 minutes, but it's a kind of memorable image and a memorable picture, and I would hate it if you left by missing that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you are all thinking about and up to in a series of beautifully framed panels from which I'm hoping to learn a lot. So thank you, Charles, for bringing everyone here to MoMA.
Good morning. Can I just ask how many landscape architects are in the room? I'm just curious if anyone has the recollection of 9 landscape architects ever being on the same stage on the same day at MoMA. We've waited a long time for this, and I know there's analogies about glass ceilings. If it was a group of architects, we could talk about glass block and breaking through. However, we're a room full of predominantly landscape architects, and I'm honored to be here in all of your presence. Before I begin, I just have a few people I'd like to thank. And before I do that, are people getting the feedback that I'm getting, or is it okay in the room? Great. Okay, maybe I have to stand back a little bit. First of all, I'd like to ask the folks from Charles Luck, I know they're all clustered in the back there, to please stand. Anyone else, and the folks that were at the registration desk. We're here being able to do this conference today because of the generous support of Charles Luck and Anderson McNeil, Heidi La Salada, and others. Thank you all so much for your tremendous support. In addition, I'd like to thank Landscape Forms. I know Scott Reinhold and Denise Smith are here, if they can just sort of wave. There they are on the other end, very balanced. Thank you to you guys. I'd also like to thank Barry here at the museum and Emma Pressler and Heather Whitney, who's been in sales and catering. They've been very helpful, so thank you all. Our media partners, Topos, and as well as the Architects newspaper, thank you for helping us get the word out and reaching an even broader audience. The tours, for those of you that are signed up on those, we'd also like to thank the New York chapter of FASLA, and in particular, Denisha Williams. For those of you that were at the dinner last night, Denisha was in overdrive, and I'm very grateful to have her here and her support as well today. And then finally, to James Corner Field Operations, who are hosting our reception. And last but not least, Suzanne Garza, Melanie Macchio on our staff, and to the wonderful Jane Amidon, who has been my curator on 2 of these now. This began with martinis at the Rossi, for those of you that know Ohio State. And this is our reunion tour, literally to this week, 3 years later, since the conference we had in Chicago. So with that, what I'd like to do is kind of take you through our conference framework for today. I couldn't resist by opening with the current issue of Art and Architecture and this wonderful quote by Carly Berwick, and with Barry in the room, I could not resist putting this up. Apparently, this past October, 100 architecture fans crowded into the steamy third-floor room of MoMA PS1 last June to hear 5 architect teams discuss their latest projects. Their mandate, solve the country's housing crisis, foreclosed, housing the American dream, and I know there are people in this room that have been involved with this, was conceived as an ongoing series of workshops that will culminate in a MoMA exhibition next February. The goal of the exhibit is to provide new models for how metropolitan areas might be improved. Bergdoll notes, the projects are not meant to provide solutions to the immediate site, they are meant to provide ideas for fundamental change. The story concludes, noting that Bergdoll is not alone in his quest to have this institution spur new thinking in urban planning and engaging in it. I would say to all of those that are involved in that, what is the role of landscape in this process, and has the time come for landscape to stand side by side with the other allied arts? A few words about the organization for today. Sorry, it's a beveled edge and it keeps slipping and distracting me. So I'll talk a little bit about the organization. First, the growing awareness of landscape, specifically through the lens of New York. Oh, thanks, Jane. Whoops. Thank you. Growing awareness of landscape. Second, when we talk about the first wave, what do we mean? And we could have a whole conference about that, and I'm sure there won't be agreement. Third is the lineage of landscape as a subject at MoMA. Fourth, what is the context for those of you that were not with us in Chicago, sort of a 2-minute Monarch Notes version. 5, Jane will then join me, and she will take over with the goals for today's conference, and we'll conclude with what we're calling the rules for today to stay on our very tight schedule. So first, growing awareness. It's interesting to me, I don't know how many people, I'm 50 years old, so I don't know how many of you New Yorkers are in my age bracket, but I remember Paul Friedberg's pork chop sideburns. I remember him arriving to work on his motorcycle. And I remember because of him and Larry Halpern that I went on to study landscape architecture. My first internship was for Paul. And one of the things I found so interesting then is that Paul did not list himself in the New York Telephone Directory under landscape architects. He did under architects. Landscape architects are now listed in the New York Telephone Directory, but they weren't then. Paul's response was no one would know to look there. And I think things have really changed since that time. And when you quiz Paul about what the state of the state was here in New York, he will tell you that the only game in town still in their sort of twilight phase was Clark and Rappuano, when he sort of splashed onto the scene. And really, I think projects like City Hall Park represent this passing of a baton here in New York City. The lower fountain, which became the Delacorte Fountain, which is no longer there, which was on the original site of the Croton Aqueduct, was thoroughly modern and forward-looking, yet it still celebrated the era of the celebration of water and the Croton Aqueduct from the mid-19th century. Moving ahead and looking at Paul's tenure, we can thank him for the deforestation of many forests in the Pacific Northwest and the success of his Timboform product, but we can also thank him for bringing a multicultural sort of perspective to landscape architecture in the infancy of the City College program. I'm curious here, and in terms of today's audience, who here either worked for Paul, went to City College, were part of that generation? Can I see hands? Wow, it's a small group. So I wanted to share with you something that Paul said when we had our Chicago conference. He gave the opening keynote at IIT. By the 1960s, there was a distinct break with the past, structurally altering the urban culture, form, means of production, and society itself. In response, this profession also experienced a break with the past, although with great resistance as the forces that compel change are subtle. With the outward migration came a new population bopping into the city, now a service center. These were young, educated singles, married and empty nesters. They chose the dynamic environment of the city. This was a society whose values were contemporary. They embraced sharing and tolerance and found gratification in excitement and culture. Times were changing fast. It was like the pilot who calls back to the passengers. The bad news is that we're hopelessly lost, but the good news is that we're going at record speed. But in spite of the speed of change, they were not lost just in search of an environment that did not yet exist. Landscape architecture, our small profession, totally unprepared for the magnitude of change, with little or no precedent, was pushed or pulled into this unfamiliar urban environment. I show you here Reese Houses, which was one of Paul's masterworks, which was demolished about a decade ago. In Landscape Forum, Peter Walker said in 1999, modern urban landscape design began with the construction of Reese Park Plaza. Like Mises' Barcelona Pavilion, it was unlike anything seen before in the modern city. One of the things you're going to see in many of these projects today is that change and continuity, that to look forward through the lens of modernism does not mean turning your back on the past. And imagine today to come to New York from the days of Friedberg and Cornell Rothschild and Clark and Rappuano and Thomas Balsley and Jim Balsley and Bill Kuhl and a handful of others, Abel Bayenson Butts. The city has exploded. It is a center of energy for landscape architecture globally. Everyone is bringing their practice here to New York. The other thing that I think we would be remiss without recognizing, and he had a significant presence last night at the ASLA dinner, is that we also have an incredibly supportive mayor who believes in design, who has been an enabling force for the park commissioner. Never, I believe, since Moses' era, has there been such a planned alignment to propel landscape architecture in this city to have the global impact that it is having today. So with that as a prelude, let me talk a little bit about what is meant when I say first wave. I'm going to put in my only cheap plug for our website today for those of you that hadn't been there, because if I ever tried to define modernism for this audience, it would take the whole day, so I'm not going to, but I will say this was a definition that was pored over by many people over many years, and there are several hundred landscapes in our database organized under the theme of modern design. I think we all tend to think that modernism begins with the Birch Alley, the Birch Staircase at Naumkeag, but in fact, before this, Fletcher Steele designed the Camden Amphitheater in Maine. 1928, he writes about it in Landscape Architecture magazine following the Paris Exposition. And so for us today, in my opinion, we begin modernism with this gesture. Second, we have this sort of period that happens 63 to 65, where there is a collective burst of energy that I don't think the profession has ever seen before or since. First with Halpern's Cities, where he celebrates the kaleidoscope of life, the same year that Cities is published, Reclaiming the Street for the Landscape Architect. We have Bob Zion doing exactly the same thing with Mr. Paley, with the Municipal Art Society, mounting an exhibition, which leads to the creation of Paley Park. Just a couple of sidebars to all of this. This is also the same year that Kiley writes a rare piece for Landscape Architecture magazine, positioning the landscape architect as orchestrator in this work, in addition to the first major piece, and I believe Tony Walmsley is here with us today. It's hard to believe that he wrote this 48 years ago. But the first major piece about Burle Marx, where he splashes onto the pages of Landscape Architecture magazine thanks to Grady Clay's editorial vision, and we will see in many of these talks, and we saw this in the first conference, the profound influence of Burle Marx. MoMA is on the scene as well during this period. I think most of us know the Kassler publication from 1964. You also, and I'll come back to that in a moment, you also have projects that are looking forward while they look back. Halpern and Worcester's work at Ghirardelli, Garrett Ekbo's work at the Pedestrian Mall in Fresno, Fulton, California. And even here in New York, we have the Capstone Career Project for Clark and Rapuano. And much to my delight and surprise, when you go back through Landscape Architecture magazine, you learn actually, for example, that the New England exhibition had paving designed by Dan Kiley. So here was Hastings, taking a leadership role in promoting the reclaiming of the street. And then in New York, in a 2-year period, Paul just blows the roof off of the city, literally. First, Carver Houses, which is the enabling project for Mrs. Astor to then engage him at Reese Houses, which appears in Landscape Architecture in 1967, From Lawns to Plazas, the Manhattan Experiment. The other end of this, and I didn't take this just because I was a big fan of the Bicentennial Minute with Lucille Ball, but in 1976, with the Bicentennial Commission under Nancy Hanks, there is a cadre of landscape architects who have an inside track. We have the Tall Ships opening and the seminal Waterfront Park by Sasaki Dawson in in Boston, Mass. Freeway Park in Seattle. Bob Zion's Waterfront Park in Cincinnati. What Paul Freeberg referred to me as limp-wristed modernism, SOM's work at Constitution Gardens. 2 projects by architects in Dallas and Fort Worth, Tranquility Park and Thanksgiving Square. And then finally, Heritage Park in Fort Worth, 1976. Every one of these projects happened in 76. So how does this fit within MoMA's lineage? Well, first we had architecture on the scene at MoMA. And you could see here, what's interesting is we all know Elizabeth Kassler, but how many people knew that her maiden name was Elizabeth Mock? And she was the architecture curator here at MoMA. Does the first book and publication, the second book solely a publication before and after. There is a smattering of landscape architects' work here, often unrecognized. For example, we have Tunnard's work that she has picked up on from his 39 publication. The press release, by the way, from MoMA says this is the first book to discuss the relationship between the modern garden and the natural landscape in terms of contemporary aesthetics. To give you just a very quick overview, the West Coast is very well represented. Halpern's leap over the garden wall at the McIntyre Garden from 61, the Donnell Garden from 47 to 50 by Church with Halpern, the Tremaine Garden by Neutra, and finally Zellerbach Plaza. Here back east, 4 Noguchi projects, the seminal unbuilt work at the Levi Memorial Playground, as well as Kylie's work for the Air Gardens Independence Mall. And Sasaki Walker's work, Bob Zion. In some cases, Zion's work goes uncredited, such as here at the MoMA Garden. But really, this is the first time that these projects are all assembled in a single publication. I couldn't resist taking this from the closing of the book. Shouldn't less be demanded of landscape design as an art than as a science? Isn't it possible that a garden or plaza or park or boulevard must finally be judged as an essay in the tenacity of the earth? If it is to pass such a test, it must appear to be of its place, not on its place, and its natural materials must seem to belong together with a more formal relationship. This could be a salvo for today. Skipping right ahead to 1988, Cornelia Oberlander hops onto the scene. We all know the book that comes out of this conference in '91. I remember this was a really, really hot ticket. How many people here made it to that conference back in? So you were one of the chosen ones. So we had, of course, Jellicoe, McHarg, Oberlander, and Kylie. The framework for that conference, historical and theoretical perspectives, modern architecture and landscape, the 20th century park. You then have to jump all the way to Burle Marx 3 years later for the first time to have a landscape architect's work hung on the walls at MoMA. Then, of course, 2005, Peter Reed at the Groundswell Show. Nearly every significant new landscape design in recent years occupies a site that did not exist as public space a half generation ago. The framework for that conference, Jane, how am I doing? Am I okay? Okay, I'll just move it along. Exchange squares, new topographies. I think almost everyone in the room is probably familiar with this exhibition. And then here we are today. I'm going to just do a very quick windshield tour of our 2008 conference. Like today, this is our framework. 5 to 8 minutes are spent on very revealing personal histories, mentors and muses, then 5 to 8 minutes on professional philosophy and ideology, and then 10 to 15 minutes on design approach. This will not be a series of presentations of what people did last summer. This was our first conference. We looked at social agenda, form and space, and material sensibilities. All of this resides on our website, but in the effort to keep moving, I will keep moving. Gives you a little sense of the kind of energy over lunch, people taking pictures of each other, Michael van Valkenburg having a real Michael hair day, we have Mark Rios in one of his signature shirts, and there was Paul beginning the whole event. So to give you an example, I love just putting first names up in this room and everyone knows who we're talking about. Martha kicked off the day, which became a de facto keynote, showing how the lineage from Church to Halpern and Sasaki and Walker led to her. She did these amazing diagrams where she looks at the lineage of how this all passes down from Pete and others at Harvard to this next generation. And she talked about her childhood, growing up with a Noguchi paper lantern on her bedside and being punished when she punched a pencil hole in it. Her parents taking her to see Martha Graham perform in Philadelphia. The lineage from Pete. Mark Rios, 3 seminal influences, Milton Avery, Alexander Gerard, Sister Mary Corita. Ken, Greenberg and Bollerod, the Barcelona chair, the table with the pink tablecloth. Ekbo's work at the Alcoa Garden, Noguchi's work, a common theme for many of the presentations at the last conference, leading up to the UNESCO Garden. Doug Reed looking at plant materials and as part of a material sensibilities panel, in particular Dr. Reich, Pete Walker, Dan Kiley, again, Burle Marx, the geometry. And now for Jane, the goals of today's conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and welcome conference participants. It's really wonderful to see such a range of familiar faces in the audience this afternoon, or this morning, soon to be afternoon, if we don't keep going on time. So I'll start also with the 2008 conference just briefly, and if that conference assumed a more or less common scale in the projects that we explored and defined each of the panels by design motivation, that is, social agenda, form and space, material sensibilities. In contrast, today at this conference, we're aggressively tackling a question of scale. We hope to look at the legacy of modernism and how it drives certain project types. This conference asks how forces of modernization and modernist paradigms are confronted by, as well as complemented by, 21st century interpretations of cultural and natural systems at the residential, urban, and metropolitan scale. This conference questions how current design values and techniques handle complex issues in the transformative agendas presented by sites with distinct, if not notorious, design histories. And most simply with this conference, we seek to understand how landscape practices are changing the way we design, why we design, and who is the design audience. As a background for establishing the goals of the conference, I'll offer 3 touchstones. First, that since the first wave of modernism, technological advancement has continued to reveal the medium of landscape with greater and greater precision from macro to micro scales, and thereby altering our definition of everything from site process to project boundaries to the parameters of maintenance. Second, that since the first wave, social mores have certainly shifted, inflecting notions of ownership, usership, and typological definition. For example, just who can occupy a public square these days? And third, that public health, infrastructure, security, and environmental concerns have gained prominence in today's world, providing ample funding streams, which is great. And in fact, the profession of landscape architecture is forecast to grow at over 15% through 2018 by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a great fact. But the other side of the coin, of course, is that these new concerns are imposing significant new design codes that profoundly impact our design strategies for landscape. So briefly, goals for today. To examine the legacy of modernism in relation to landscape complexity and transformation. And second, to identify landscape tools, techniques, practices, and media developed by this generation of designers in response to sites and modernist histories. It's our hope that the perspectives and practices presented today will reveal dialogues between original modernist stances and contemporary decision points. Like the first conference, we have broken into 3 panels. The first panel, Residential Transformations, is moderated by Job Moore, and I'll let him introduce the speakers. Panel 2, Urban Renewal, is moderated by Thaisa Wei. And panel 3, Metropolitan Transformations, moderated by Brad McKee. There are bios and abstracts in your pamphlets, in your handouts. And the rules, very strict. Time limit for today, which we will adhere to from here forward. Schedule overview. Each panel has 90 minutes, and that's including the moderator's introduction. We have a system of warning signs, which I'm showing you just so that you have sympathy with our speakers. 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and stop now. You may hear the bell. And closing discussions. We are eager to have comments and questions submitted by the audience. You can do so either via Twitter, #TCLF, or via index cards, which will be available on the table out in the lobby. We need to vacate the room and I'm sorry, those questions and comments will be incorporated or responded to by the moderators in the closing session. And then finally, we need to vacate the room at 4:20. We need to be fairly strict about this, and anybody who is not able to register upstairs, there'll be registration desks outside in the immediate theater lobby here. So, Let us begin with residential transformation.